So here we are, the Sunday before Advent. We might understand it as the last Sunday in the church year, so it's kind of New Year's Eve. And what do you do on New Year's Eve, those who are prone to do such things? You kind of look back at the year that's been, consider who we are and where we are a year on, think of what might be coming in the year. In a church year, we follow this liturgical calendar. You could understand that over the year, through that calendar, we trace the life of Jesus, if we don't look too closely or expect historical accuracy anyway, because Jesus is born and die quite quickly, but then there's the story afterward. So throughout the year, we follow the story of Jesus' life and influence through the lens of one of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And the Gospel of John gets a look in at particular times or seasons in the year. So there's a sort of chronology, and not. We have feast days that mark significant events in the life of the church, and saints' days also throughout the year. The seasons of the church year, the liturgical material, the words we use associated with the calendar, the colours, the imagery and so forth, they all come from a Northern Hemisphere context. So at times we can feel a little bit as if we're working against ourselves down here in the south. This liturgical tradition names the Sunday before Advent Christ the King's Sunday. I know, we don't do that here. Even the reign of Christ is too much. I might add, look at the middle window at the back there. Power and honour and glory of Christ on a throne. Look at the building around us. I've had little girls come and say to me, "Is this the castle where a princess lives?" Just saying. So there are other options. We can choose Aotearoa Sunday, or we can choose Ordinary 34, or we can choose Sunday before Advent. I get that the king imagery makes us uncomfortable. But given that it occurs at the end of the year, the ending triumph of the life cycle of Jesus, some sort of claim is being made by the statement, and I think is worth wrestling with. Not to try and agree with it, not to contort ourselves into compliance, but to ask ourselves, after this last year, looking back and thinking forward, how would we name Christ? What words resonate with whatever it is we imagine that Christ to be for us? Who have we felt we have met the Christ in over the year? That divine presence that we experience in human form. Now, allowing for the fact that we may feel, in response to that, absolutely no idea. I get that. We don't know for certain. Maybe we experience more absence than presence. I want to say that is valid and real. Perhaps it is more accurate to ask what it is the idea of this, that divine presence in human form meets us, what that opens us to, what it opens in us. Christ the King Sunday follows hard on the heels of last Sunday's readings. First we had that reading from Isaiah with the imagery of a world restored and life flourishing. And then we had the gospel about the temple's destruction with all that apocalyptic imagery and messaging that Wilf so helpfully unpacked last week. Jesus is inviting his followers to see through the grandeur of the temple, of temple might, of empire. To not respond to what appears end-time destruction, when under persecution not to join those proclaiming judgment and spreading narratives of despair. Rather, in the midst of that, to trust in the presence of God, beneath, within, continuing, threaded through life, threaded through us. A quick look at church history might help us to see why we react as we do to the church's kingly claim. The church, from its humble outsider beginnings, became empire's religion, first under Constantine. It joined the empire's drive to colonize and to capture and to dominate. There was a little bit of intention in that gradual hymn that you just sung, by the way. This may be the core of our distaste for celebrating Christ as King. Today's growing irrelevance of church for increasing numbers and its declining capacity to influence, you'd think it might free us from the bondage to such obligation. But such identity continues to permeate our church structure. The church still operates as it knows, thinking it wields power and influence, and operating according to the systems of the ruling powers. And in certain places still, under the rubric of church, God is weaponized by some to serve their own ends. So is it possible for us to claim some less empire-associated identity for Christ? Christ we can claim as King or ruler. I'm still a bit hinky about King myself, but in an inverted way. Today's gospel pushes us this way. Today's gospel insists that the one who rules is one who insists on the inherent worth of all living beings, and shuns power over, power humanly gained, even to death. But what does that mean in real life? Because as soon as we put out some sort of absolute claim, we tend to use it as a rallying point, something to gather and build identity around, something that becomes our imagining of what we think we mean. I've been wondering quite a lot lately about this hope that we hold on to, that there could be a different world order. As we look around the world today, this notion seems pretty impossible. In all the history of human civilization, very few years have been without war. When we imagine a new order, a world that embodies the life and Spirit of God, is that way of being fundamentally different from society as we know it? Or do we just give it a different skin? And we hope the skin will lead to different outcomes. It seems to me this is most unlikely. We may overlay the language of empire by declaring this leadership, this kingness, is different. It's an alternate model. It's a different type of ruler, a different way of rule. But does it translate, displacing the ideology of one king for another, but doing nothing to change the structure or the systems? This happens not because we are unwilling or ill-intended, but because we don't know how to live differently. We have learned what we know. They may be flawed, but the systems and structures we have, we see as necessary to maintain order, for effecting transactions between nations and people in an increasingly complex world. Without their protection, the world may descend into chaos. At least that's what we've learned. Trust the systems, distrust relationships, because they are inherently dangerous and inconsistent. They are always having to be negotiated. They are not reliable, and they make you terribly vulnerable. whether we're talking about relations between humans or relationships with the wildness of creation, which actually seems to do quite well, left to its own chaotic rhythm. To think and talk of kings and empire is to think and talk about power. Human systems of power over, hierarchies where resources and power diminish as they descend. It's easy for us to think of these as immutable realities, that unless you have the power or influence at the top, you can effect no change. So we tend to think in the macro, we have to change it all. And before that macro, we feel very, very micro. Insignificant, ineffective, before all that's happening. Our sense that we might have power or capacity to change things diminishes in equal measure, despite the fire in our belly. A sense of helplessness can pervade us. We can't change everything, and we don't have to. The desire to have the power to enact our preferred outcomes makes us no different than those in the system we challenge. What we can do is we can participate in making real in our places of connection and influence the change that we imagine. We can in those places do differently. We can explore and try and test what it's like to share power and to collaborate rather than dominate. It's easy to be overwhelmed and to be distracted by the macro because it's big and it's loud and it's insistent and it's overwhelming. But we're enormously empowered in our micro. You may have heard the Dalai Lama say, and I think it may be an African proverb, if you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. You see, we need around us those who also tell this alternate, insistent story. It helps us remember. It helps us to enact it when and where we are. But I want to share with you as I finish a poem by Roberto Che Espinosa on the theme of Advent, the beginning of Advent. Beloveds, the world is ending again. Not the world of rivers and mycelium and ancestors, not the world of breath and bodies and shared meals, but the world that harms, the world that lies, the world that builds saviours out of violence. Let it end. Let the illusions fall so we can finally see. Let the false messiahs fade so we can finally refuse. Let empire crack so imagination can run free. And while the old world collapses, listen closely. There is a hum rising beneath your feet. A new world, tender and fierce, aching to be born. Isaiah has seen it. Jesus has named the clarity we need to reach it. You can feel it in your chest, even now. Advent contra empire is the invitation to midwife that world with our bodies, our breath, our courage, and our care.